run a giant conglomerate about to be expanded further by a big acquisition of Precision Castparts. And these businesses in your company operate in about every industry. You had a board of directors meeting in Dallas about 10 days ago, and you're entitled to tell why you had it in Dallas. What did you tell your directors about the health of the economy as seen by this huge block of businesses?
Yeah, well, to some extent they tell us too, because they're coming, we have reports on 8 big businesses. But the interesting thing about the economy is that you could give almost the same report ever since the fall of 2009. And it really has been growing, is growing at a couple % a year, which is not bad, as we might get into later. But people have gotten more optimistic at times. They've thought about double dips at times, and then they thought it was accelerating. Our experience has been that certain areas have accelerated a lot, like autos recently, but the overall gain keeps running at about 2% per year, and that's been really quite steady, and that's what we see now.
And I assume that you see, I mean, how about housing? You've got big investments in housing one way or the other.
Housing's picking up. Our furniture stores are running at good gains. Our carpet's running at decent gains. Brick has picked up somewhat, but it's still slow. But overall, you just see a couple %. I think the industrial area has slowed down a little bit. If you look at our cutting tools and that sort of thing, and they tend to be on kind of a real-time basis, because nobody loads up on cutting tools and thought there's going to be a big speculative boom in them or something. We just keep seeing a couple %.
And how, is this disappointing to you? Or
not in the least.
Not in the least. You think it's good?
Well, let me give you a figure. I mean, people do get disappointed in 2%. The population of the United States grows at about 0.8% a year. There's about 0.5% from births over deaths, about 0.3% from migration. So that's 1.2% per capita you're getting if you're getting 2% growth by the time you take off the 0.8. You take a generation, and a generation now is much more like 25 years. People have babies later. That means in one generation, you're going to get, not even allowing for compounding, you get 30% gain in real output per capita. Now you start out, the US has $54,000 of GDP per capita. Take 30% more of that, that means another $16,000 per person in real terms in one generation. And if you take 2.7 people in a household, take 2.7 times 16 is 32 plus 11 is $43,000 of household GDP gain in one generation. I mean, it's mind-blowing. Our kids are going to live so much better than we live now. That's not so difficult in my family, as my kids will tell you. But the gains. I mean, everybody in my neighborhood. I live in sort of a normal neighborhood, and everybody in my neighborhood lives better than John D. Rockefeller Sr. lived in the year I was born. And everybody in this country, in 2 generations, virtually everybody will live better than I live. Our country is a marvelous economic machine, and people talk about 2%. And they think that's kind of discouraging, but it's miraculous what compound interest does over time.
Well, you've now done, as you've always done in these sessions, you've expressed your faith in the U.S. economy looking out there. Now, I'm going to go back to the stock market here because I assume there might have been a little conversation at that board of directors meeting about the stock market. And I know you don't like to give predictions about the direction of the stock market, but what can you say to us? It's crazy. The stock market's been crazy in a sense. You don't think it's been crazy?
No.
Okay, well, right away, that's a starter.
No,
okay.
It hasn't moved around that. I mean, the stock market, the day-to-day movements are not that dramatic if you look over history. And the thing about the stock market, in the 20th century, we had 2 world wars, a Great Depression, God knows how many recessions, flu epidemics, atomic bomb, you name it. The Dow Jones average went from 66 to 11,400. The stock market does wonderfully over time because American business does wonderfully over time. I bought my first stock in April of 1942. We were losing the war at that time. I mean, that was 4 or 5 months after the war broke out. And the Dow was at 100, you know. The Dow was at whatever it is now, 17,000. I mean, all my life I've heard people talk about how terrible things are. And, you know, you're hearing it in the political campaign now, you know, make America great again. America's great now. It's never been greater. And it's ridiculous. I mean, just compare how we're living to 20 years ago. Just think of what the internet does for me. And I'm writing an annual report. I want to get a fact here or there on something or the other. I used to have to go to the library or right away to some government bureau. You know, now I have it in 10 seconds. The world is changing all the time for the better, and it gallops. And in one person's lifetime, I'm 85. In one person's lifetime, real GDP per capita in the United States has gone up 6 for 1. Now just imagine if you told my dad in the waiting room, you know, that your kid is going to see a 6 for 1 increase in the average GDP. I mean, he thought the country had already gone pretty far. They discovered the auto and the airplane and a few things. He thought there was nothing left to discover at that time. Right. You know, we found it all. And that's the way people always seem to feel. But this country, there's never been anything like it, and there never will be, and we're going to look back 50 years from now or 100 years from now and think this was the dark ages.
Well, let me switch now to a topic where some people would say we do not have an improved situation, and others would say we do have. That has the combined topic of corporate governance and activists. We have seen the number of activists rise. I think you might even start off with the thought that if corporate governance was better, we wouldn't have as many activists. Would that be true?
Well, if every company were being managed well, there certainly wouldn't be any reason for activists. There might still be a few, but there wouldn't be any reason for it. But the truth is that at some companies, the managers kind of forget who they're really working for, and you know, it becomes their own playpen. And at others, managements are sometimes incompetent. We're not saying often. And you know, it's the job of a board when that occurs to do something about it, and sometimes they don't. So there's a reason why activism makes sense. It's in certain cases. I don't think the bulk of activism relates to that. The bulk of activism just wants a quick hit. They want the stock to go up next week. And at Berkshire, I've always said we run our company for the shareholders who are going to stay and not the ones who are going to leave. And you know, the finest companies in America many times are selling at a discount for what they are worth that moment. When I bought the Washington Post company in 1973, bought stock in it, it was selling at 1/5 of what the properties were worth. Cap Cities at the same time was selling at 1/5 of what the properties were worth. They were both wonderful companies, but the whole market was depressed. And so anytime a stock is selling below what could be realized for it is not a reason to go out and sell the business. The activists want that to happen, and of course they've attracted far more money for management. So what was a relatively small little industry 10 years ago has become a big business now, and they're like sharks. They got to keep swimming, and so as they attract more money, they have to go after things, and they stretch for targets, and you're seeing that. But there is a place for them in America. I mean, all American businesses are not being run in the interest of their shareholders with really capable management. And when that happens, change is needed, and sometimes boards do it, but other times they don't.
What is your own personal appetite for joining with the activists?
Well, it's zero.
Zero.
Yeah. No, I don't. My partner Charlie Munger told me 50 years ago. He says, if you want to guarantee yourself a life of misery, marry somebody with the idea of changing them. He said, you will be miserable the rest of your life. So I'm not really interested in getting into that. It's so much easier just to buy in with a bunch of people that are wonderful people doing it, that have a common goal and join in the spirit of the whole organization. Right. So I'm just not looking for that kind of trouble.
Just to fill out that thought of Charlie Munger's there, didn't he also say that if you want to have a happy marriage, be sure to go in with...
No, he said if you want to have a marriage that will last. He
that's
said,
right.
He said not necessarily a marriage made in heaven,
And, okay.
but he said just one that will last. He said, what quality do you look for in a spouse? Do you look for beauty? Do you look for brains? Do you look for character? Do you look for honesty? You look for humor? No. If you want a marriage that'll last, look for someone with low expectations. He's a very practical guy.
Now, a year ago, you made news at this conference by saying that Hillary would run for president, and furthermore, that she would win. Since then, a lot of water has gone over the dam, or maybe I should say a lot of emails have been stored in the server.
Gone over the server, yeah.
Some server, at least. What are your up-to-date thoughts about Hillary's prospects?
I think she is by far the most likely person to get the Democratic nomination. I think she is the most likely person to be president of the United States. And no, I think that, and actually I saw some odds that were presented a day or two ago on the probabilities.
What were they?
Well, I think she was 4 to 5, which was considerably better than anybody else on becoming president. I think she is the most likely person to become president. It's still a long ways off, but and you could have illness and you could have all kinds of things happen. But she's the most likely. The Democrats are most likely to win if they get turnout. I mean, in 2012, they did a much better job than they had historically in bringing out their base. And if they remember the lessons of that and maybe use the same people, the demographics keep moving in their direction. So, they're probably at least a half a percentage point better, maybe even a full percentage point, and that's a lot in elections, better off just in terms of demographics than they were 4 years ago. But they do have a good many of their base have a low propensity to vote. And so you need an organization that makes sure you get your share of the vote out.
Well, and how about the email controversy? Do you think that could maybe have been handled a little bit better?
Yeah, it could have been handled better. Yeah.
Okay. Well, by the way, I guess during this election season, you have really had your time consumed by the fact that you're buying this big company, Precision Castparts. Have you really been bearing down on that, talking to the CEO and so forth?
Well, it's a big acquisition for us. It's $32 billion. I met the CEO on July 1st. I met him for about 10 or 15 minutes. He actually was coming in to visit a fellow in our office who owns stock as part of his portfolio. So I happened to be there. That was accidental. And I thought I'd drop in and just see what this guy looked like. And so I was there for the last 10 or 15 minutes. And when he left, I could tell that this fellow would be able to run his business a lot better if he were a private or under the wing of Berkshire. So I said to Todd, who had been in the reason for the visit, I said, why don't we give him a call? It was right afterwards, and say if he would like an offer from us, we would make one, but we wouldn't make it unless if he had any objection to it. And so we called him, and he checked with his board, and he said, fine, we're willing to listen to an offer. So I'd met him maybe 10 minutes at that time. Then he came up to Sun Valley, where I was at the Allen Company thing. I met him for about 15 minutes there. This fellow gets to the point very quickly. It's hard to make the conversation last. So I made him an offer. He said he'd take it to his board, and he got back in touch with me a little later, and he said there were a couple members of the board that thought it was worth more, and I said that was interesting. But we don't go up on price. So we made a deal in any event. I probably met this man who was an outstanding manager. He's just our kind of guy. Mark Donegan's his name. And I probably met him maybe a total of 80 minutes now or so. I mean, we didn't get one piece of information. We do know due diligence. You know, my due diligence is to look into their eyes, basically. And we do know due diligence. We did not have a figure that was not public. The one thing I ask them is, if, assuming we treat you right, do you have any intention of retiring at 65? You know, because I'm totally dependent on him. He doesn't need me, I need him. And so I really have to know that. I usually have a judgment about that anyway, just from talking to him, yeah. I'm just actually, we own a company called Garan. Have you ever heard of Garanimals? Those of you who have young kids. The CEO of that company, which we bought it in 2002. He was 76 then. He's going to be 90 on March 16th. And I will guarantee you that he has not had a thought of retiring, this fellow that runs it.
And I know you feel good about
well,
that.
I like that kind of guy, yeah, right. Yeah, my thoughts on retiring are sort of a moving target, you know. I mean, Charlie's 91, he'll be 92 on January 1st, and he's my canary in the coal mine, you know. It's like
Well, I must say that people keep saying to me, now what can you tell us about the next CEO of Berkshire? And my first answer to them is, have you thought about the timing? I said, you've got to have a timing in mind. If you were to pick somebody right now, it might be X. But if it's 10 years from now, and I personally believe that Warren will be CEO then, unless he has physically or mentally declined, which I don't see any sign of, I said 10 years from now, that other guy might be completely worn out. Is it pretty
you ought to write a story on that.
Well, listen, I'm writing it in effect here by telling that. Well, now I want to come back to politics. The Republicans. How is this crazy contest for the Republican nomination going to turn out? And is it going to be settled eventually by what you and I grew up with, which was conventions at which it was left to be decided at the convention?
It could happen. It could happen. Back in 1924, I think the Democratic convention went 103 ballots. And the two people who got a combined 80% on the first ballot, neither one of them even ended up with the vice presidency. So really strange things happen at conventions. I don't know whether you've ever been to any, but
no,
they've changed in in complexion over the years, but this one could change back. I mean, somebody could go there with a plurality, but not a majority. So it will be, I mean, this is something we haven't seen before, when you've got three non-politicians with an aggregate of 50% of the vote on the Republican side. And what we're really seeing in government right now, and I think it's manifesting itself a little bit in these debates and what's happening in the polls now. You know, we've always thought in terms of two-party government, but we now really have three-party government, and we're seeing that in the speaker selection. I mean, you may have them only calling themselves Republicans and Democrats, but there's a distinct party now within the Republican Party, and you have three-party government, and the traditional Republican Party has a plurality, but they do not have a majority. And that's something we really haven't come to grips with much in this country. We are not, in terms of culture, in terms of rules, in terms of a whole bunch of things, we have been set up for two-party government, and we don't know how to deal yet with three-party government, and that's accentuated by the fact that in the Senate, you know, they changed the cloture rule in 1975. There wasn't any cloture to speak of before that. So now you can have a majority in the Senate, but you still have a third party, which is the cloture vote, you can call it, needing to get to 60 votes for anything that's important. So we are actually dealing with a governing situation that before 1975 would not have existed in either house, and we're struggling with it. And to imagine that you can't find anybody who wants to be Speaker of the House, you know, is just startling to me. My dad was in the House of Representatives, I mean, and Sam Rayburn was Speaker of the House, and I mean, he was one powerful guy, and of course the Speaker is number 3 in line to be president too. So it's really, you're witnessing sort of a quiet revolution in terms of how America will be governed, and we may go back to the old system. We may find a way that we can get it back to 2 parties, but it is not a 2-party system now.
And do you have any anticipation of how it's going to turn out?
No, I don't, because you don't have 3 parties that are going to cooperate with each other. I mean, their differences are not really very negotiable. Now, it's a great spectator sport. I wouldn't want to be a participant, but I like it as a spectator sport.
Okay, this is going to be my last question. We're going to turn to questions from the audience, so you could be trying to attract the attention of somebody with a microphone. In the vastly decentralized operation that is Berkshire Hathaway, what happens when you have a subsidiary being run by a CEO not up to the job? How do you get that person out of there, and how much of a personal part do you play in the action?
Well, if you have 80 or so subsidiaries, they really all report to me, basically. And our batting average has been good about getting people. And of course, we don't get rid of them at 65. So I milk people for all they're worth. I mean,
I know.
When you hit the junk heap at Berkshire, you're ready for the junk heap, believe me. Seymour is very safe in his job at 90 when but occasionally we need somebody different. Sometimes they just aren't up to the job. Sometimes actually age is a factor, and that's very tough when age is a factor, because since we have no retirement age, when I go to see someone that's been a friend for decades and done all kinds of things for me, I can't go and say, well, we have this mandatory retirement age of 70 or something, and I'm sorry, I know you'd be good for another 20 years. It isn't true. I have to say, you aren't what you were before. I don't say it that way, but that's the message I'm delivering. I hate that. And so I always do it too late. I procrastinate. And I say, well, we got 80 companies. If 79 are running okay, we can handle that. I come up with any damn thing I need to avoid the unpleasantness. But I do it myself, and it's usually not as bad as I think it's going to be. But the job is mine of making changes in management, and I would give a lot to not have that job, but there really isn't anyone I can turn it over to. We had one company run by a guy that Charlie and I both loved. I mean, the guy was just wonderful. We didn't see him very often. One of our managers I haven't seen for 10 years. He made me go on. There's probably some guy just say, what little figure should we send Buffett this month, But we had this one guy, and he was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful guy. He done all kinds of things for me and Charlie. And he developed Alzheimer's. And we saw him very infrequently, and I think he sort of got himself up for the event, if he would see it. So he really ran this company with Alzheimer's for a couple of years, and finally it became obvious. But I really thought that was a pretty good test, that you should buy companies that are good enough so that a guy with Alzheimer's can run them. It's a new yardstick we have at Berkshire. I hope they fly it with a CEO someday. I'm talking up this new yardstick.